Hi and welcome back to the UK's Human Landscape. Today in Lesson 7 we are looking at contrasting two areas of a city that is our case study. So we're looking at London as our case study for the whole of Inquiry Question 2, and our two areas that we're looking at today and we will continue to look at in the coming lessons are Richmond and Newham. Now these two areas make an interesting example for us because they have quite contrasting qualities of life for their residents and very, very different levels of deprivation. So today is an overview of those two areas and we will dive right in. So today, as part of Inquiry Question 2, we are comparing Newham and Richmond, and we're going to start ourselves off with a very straightforward task, please. Can we please use this map of London? It doesn't show you much about the surrounding areas, but just the different boroughs of London, to describe where these places are. I would like a description of the location of Richmond, which is over here, upon Thames on the left, and Newham, which is on the right. Of course, using our geographical terminology, i.e. compass points. This description, as with everything else that we do in this lesson, should be written in your worksheet, which you have been given with the lesson, which looks like this. So you type directly into the worksheet that you've been given here, please. Okay, you can type on this, it's your own version. That's what I would like you to do. Pause the video, off you go. Okay, so you should hopefully have gotten to the point where you're saying that Richmond upon Thames is in the southwest of London. Okay, it's technically south of the river. I don't know if you can see the little snaky bit here. Okay, it's technically south of the river. It's quite far towards the west of London, and Newham is in the northeast of London. Okay. Our next task then is to start looking in a bit of detail. Now, you've seen a slide very similar to this a few lessons ago, and this slide just talks a bit about the index of multiple deprivation. So deprivation, as we've already said, is where something is lacking. And what we mean by that is that there is a material lack of these things: income, employment, education, skills and training, or a lack of health care that impacts on people's lives. So if we've got that same map down here on the left showing us where Newham and Richmond is, here on the right is a chloropleth map of London, showing some areas that are amongst the most deprived and least deprived. I've left the circles on there so that you can see roughly where Richmond falls and where Newham falls. And there is a stark contrast when we're looking at these combined measures of deprivation, in that Richmond has a relatively low level of deprivation down here, light yellow colours, and Newham has higher levels of deprivation. And today's lesson we're going to delve into what does that really look like. Next lesson as well, we're going to be looking at Newham and Stratford in particular in terms of one of these aspects of multiple deprivation. And next lesson, that's going to be crime. Today we're going to look at some of these other things. Okay, so on your worksheet, our second task is to have a little look at some of these key indicators of deprivation. So I've just shown you some of them, and they're here again. So depending on the category that we're talking about, it's either good for this number to be high or it's good for it to be low. We have to understand what numbers we're looking at to understand whether it's good for it to be high or good for it to be low. Let's take, for example, the first one. Infant mortality rate, infants being children. Mortality is the death rate, okay? So if we have high mortality of children, lots of children dying, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a bad thing, isn't it? So if it's a bad thing, then we want the number of this thing to be very low, okay? And what we notice is that Richmond's rate of infant mortality, the number of children who die out of every 1,000 born, is only 1.5, whereas in Newham, 3.3. Again, averages, yeah, 1/3 of a baby cannot die, but on average, 3.3 babies in Newham die, okay, out of 1,000. So who has the worst outcome here? Which of these two places is more deprived? And hopefully you've come to the conclusion that it's Newham. And so you'd write in this box, Newham, please. You're going to do that for all of these. Let's just double check. Are there any of these that we want the number to be high? Do we want premature mortality to be high? Definitely not. In fact, premature mortality is something we've discussed already with reference to Newham. We said that in this coronavirus crisis, that Newham has amongst the highest death rates in the country of people who wouldn't otherwise be expected to die this year. And that is, of course, fitting into that premature mortality statistic. And this number here will be out of date before the end of the year. The poverty rate, something we want it to be low. Child poverty also low. Housing affordability, okay, a bit of a difficult one. This is the median rent, so the average rent, not quite average, it's a type of an average. The median rent as a percentage of median pay. So how much of what you earn should go on your rent? Basic, having a roof over your head. How many people are living in temporary accommodation? How many people are sleeping on the streets? That's what we mean by rough sleeping. It's being homeless and sleeping on the street. Unemployment rates, another thing that we would like to be low. But if we look down here at GCSE attainment, we would hope that GCSE attainment needs to be high, okay? Because these are the percentage of pupils who achieve grades 4 to 9. So once you have worked out whether or not which of those places is more deprived in each of those categories, I would like you to answer the 3 questions, which are these questions, below the table. Okay, so pause the video, take some time to think about it, answer the questions to the best of your ability, and then we'll move on. So let's have a look at some of those answers. Can you highlight in green anything that you are adding that you haven't done by yourself? So just overall then, you should have discovered that Newham is a much more deprived place than Richmond in every category we looked at. Now, for some categories, it's going to be significantly more deprived, and other categories, a little bit more deprived. You might also have noticed something else. Over here, I've given you the London averages where I've got them, okay? So for example, when we compared Richmond and Newham's infant mortality rate, we said Newham's is quite a lot higher than Richmond's. But if we compare it to London as a whole, it's pretty much the same. So what we're saying is perhaps Newham is not deprived so much as Richmond is privileged in the context of infant mortality. Whereas if we were talking about down here, unemployment rates, we would say that Richmond has lower unemployment than the London average and Newham has higher unemployment than the London average. Okay, now when we're describing our results, when we're writing our answers, we need to use evidence as much as possible. You're not going to be able to get into that exam and remember every fact you ever learned, but it's important that you have a couple of key facts that you can take into your exam with you. So let's have a look at some of those answers then. Richmond upon Thames is an outer London borough located in the southwest. That was the answer to the very first question. It has some of the lowest poverty rates in all of the London boroughs. It also has the lowest unemployment rate at 3.4% and the lowest infant mortality rate. However, okay, pay inequality is high here compared to other parts of London. So what we're saying by pay inequality, do you remember we said that means that not everyone earns the same, which we don't always think is quite fair. We don't always think that's equitable. What we're saying is that the poorest in Richmond and the richest in Richmond have very, very different levels of income. So actually, although Richmond has higher average incomes, maybe that's dragged up by a few people, relatively few people who are a lot wealthier than others. When we look at Newham then, Newham is a borough in the inner east of London which experiences significant problems with poverty and inequality. And we've got lots of evidence to suggest there's issues with poverty and inequality. The child poverty rate in Newham is 52%. Okay, housing affordability, people spending more than half of their salary on just renting a home, having somewhere to live. Okay, and the number of people living in temporary accommodation is very, very high. And even down here, we see GCSE attainment, the results that people get in Newham are lower than those in Richmond. So there's some, privilege and and benefit afforded to people who live in Richmond. So, unemployment and out of work benefits claimant rates are not much higher than London averages, okay? So what we're saying is unemployment is higher, but not that much higher. How much higher was it? Was 0.8% higher unemployment? So a lot of people have jobs. So even though they have a job, they're still struggling maybe with being poor or having a high level of poverty or struggling to afford their housing. What does that indicate? That you've got a job, but that you don't earn enough. Maybe you're earning minimum wage. Maybe you only work part-time. Maybe your work doesn't pay you a consistent amount. It doesn't pay you the same every month. Say, for example, if you drive a taxi cab, it will depend on how many people you're able to drive around that will dictate how much you earn that month. So it could be higher than you're expecting, it could be lower, and that gives you a great deal of uncertainty. Okay, so there is a very high rate of households in temporary accommodation, with 45 per thousand, contrasting, big difference here between 16 per thousand in London overall, okay? Evictions are also higher. Does everybody know what an eviction is? What does it mean if you get evicted from your home? It means that you get kicked out of your home, okay? So evictions are where maybe you can't pay your rent, or maybe the landlord wants to take over the property for some reason. They can kick you out, they can ask you to leave. And so evictions are higher here than in most London boroughs, running at 3.4 households per 1,000 compared to 1.8 households for London overall. So some big differences, some that are not huge differences, but we still can think of reasons why that might be particularly problematic. Okay, just double check your answers, improve them if they need that. We're moving on to task 3. So, what are Richmond and Newham like? Okay, and this, is difficult because obviously however I present it to you may be the way that you think about it. Yeah, my own biases about these two places are going to influence what your thoughts on these places are. And although there is lots of evidence, as we've already looked at, for differences, you must understand that there are still wealthy people going to be living in Newham as much as there are wealthy people living in Richmond. There's probably just more wealthy people in Richmond than Newham. So 2 images here. You can see in Richmond here, we've got the fact that it's located on the Thames. Perhaps that creates quite a nice environment for people to live in. We're going to compare this a little bit more by looking at some of the headlines that come up that show you what those places are a bit more like. Now, headlines are a really interesting thing to analyse for us in geography because they don't just tell us the fact about a place. Very often they tell us about how that place is being portrayed. What kind of language do the newspapers use when they describe it? What is the perception of that place? So that influences how people view those places. You could try this for yourself by Googling Newham and Richmond and seeing what kinds of things come up. Okay, I would really strongly advise you to do that, but our next task is going to be just having a little look at some headlines. So there are quite a few headlines here, and what I'd like you to do is tell me the overall impression given of these areas based on the news stories written about them. Can you work out first which headlines belong to which location? We've got a couple of things here. We've got women's life at risk as refuges for BME survivors face closure. BME stands for Black Minority Ethnic, so we're talking about people of colour in this instance. A London state school gets 51 Oxbridge offers, so that's offers for Oxford and Cambridge universities. Very good. Man stabbed to death. Man who attacked people in the street dies after police restraint. So having been restrained by the police, he died. East London house prices are still on the up despite a UK slowdown. We're going to look in more detail at house prices a bit later. Where do you think that those headlines are for? Virginia Woolf's former London home listed for sale at £3.25 million. Virginia Woolf was a very famous writer. London house prices experienced lowest growth since financial crisis. So maybe a slightly contradictory headline to this one down here. Protests banned outside abortion clinic. Where Londoners should move to beat state school places bun fight. So people fighting over state school places. And this one gives it away a little bit. Richmond is voted the happiest place to live in London. So of these headlines, which ones do you think belong to Richmond and which ones do you think belong to Newham? So answers. Over here on the left, all of those headlines, good and bad. So this one up here about Oxbridge offers and house prices still being up in East London, those are all based in Newham. Okay, this house prices still being up thing is debatable whether it's a good thing. I'm sure a lot of people are happy about that. Okay, but for some, it may be really problematic. And on the right here, then, these are all Richmond headlines. Okay, so it's not that there aren't problems in Richmond, but just that they are perhaps slightly different. Can you write for me now a sentence or two under the task 3 heading? What overall impression is given of these areas based on these news stories that have been written about them? These are all ones I took off the Independent newspaper website just this last week. So, task 4 then. Task 4 is a gap fill. Now, I know that feels perhaps a little bit silly, but what I want you to do here is use that gap fill to really extract information from this graph, because it's quite a complicated graph. There's quite a few things, so let's start to break that down. On the left here, we notice that we've got 3 different time periods. So this is showing us how the ethnic mix in Newham has changed over time. We already mentioned that Newham was an incredibly diverse place in a previous lesson, but here we're saying, has it become more diverse or less diverse, and in what ways has that happened? So we've got 3 time periods, and the bar changes length because the total population of Newham has grown over this time period. Along with that, we see that the diversity of Newham, the number of different people from different backgrounds, has also grown, and there's been changes in the proportions, the percentages of people from each background. So I'd like you to fill in the gap fill on your worksheet based on your analysis of this graph. Please leave your answers for the gap fill highlighted in yellow so that we can see where you have put them in. Pause the video, off you go. So this next task, not dissimilar from the last one, but here I haven't given you a gap fill and is a much simpler graph. I'd like you please to write me a PEE paragraph, just a short one, but using some evidence about ethnicity and diversity in Richmond. You might even want to make an L to make it a PEEL paragraph statement. You're going to add a link to maybe compare it with Newham. Okay, so what do we notice here? That Richmond is a majority white borough, that there is some diversity of people from mixed backgrounds. The second largest category is people from an Asian background, a small number of people from black backgrounds and other backgrounds as well. You may even be able to come up with a reason for that. So, task 5. Let's have a look at some key population statistics. We're looking specifically at Newham here. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, once we've looked at these key statistics, I want you to answer these 3 questions. Again, they are on your worksheet. You just type your answers in straight underneath. Okay, so on the left-hand side here, we've got some babies. In the age category of 0 to 4 years, 8% of the population. In the category of 0 to 17 years, so this is children and young people, 24%. So almost a quarter of Newham's population is young people. And I have to say that is quite high, sorry. It's quite a surprising number of people. In the 18 to 64 age category, why do we want to look at that, do you think? Why is that significant? We would normally suggest that people from the ages of 18 to 64 are what we would consider economically active. They are our working age population. We expect these people to be working. And we have 68% of Newham's population falling within this category. Finally then, our 65 years and older, most likely to be retired and not working, are our elderly dependents, and they are 7.5% of the population. So pretty much the same number of 65-year-olds and over as there are 0 to 4-year-olds, okay? And what we notice is this gives us a median age of 31. The majority of people, the middle age rather, of people in Newham is 31.9 years old, which is lower than London as a whole. So Newham has a younger population, not just because of its young people, but perhaps also because of its working age population. Okay. Answering these three questions then, the first question is about why it's economically important to have lots of 18 and 64-year-old people. Thinking about the children, what kind of services and facilities need to be provided for these young children, okay, or even for these children and young people. And then finally, some ideas about, okay, things are changing, things are getting regenerated, improved. Why does that maybe attract more young people in their 20s and 30s to the area? Answering those questions for me, please. Pause the video. Off you go. Right then, we're going to have a look now at two maps, and I know that these are very busy, but we're going to do a comparison of them. We don't need to do a huge amount, but we're going to look at this map, which is of Newham, okay? Up here on the left-hand side, you should be able to see Stratford. What's this ring-shaped thing over here? That is, of course, the Olympic Stadium, okay? That is the London Stadium, which is currently occupied by West Ham Football Club. We can see much of Newham, the London Borough of Newham then. We've got West Ham, we've got East Ham, we've got all this area down here, which are the old docks. And in fact, this exhibition centre in recent months has become a major hospital. If you've heard of the London Nightingale Hospital, that is where it is based, in the exhibition centre there. So if this is our sort of map of Newham, let's have a look at this map of Richmond. Slightly different. One notable thing is the river, okay? Much smaller and thinner because we're further away from its mouth. There seem to be some blank spaces here though. What do we think these blank spaces are? Up here we have an old deer park, some gardens, an observatory. Does anyone know what this symbol is? It's the same as this down here. It's a golf course. And of course, right smack bang in the middle here, this big blank space. And there's some lovely clues on here because it is a good map. Lots of forested areas, some ponds. This is Richmond Park. What difference then does it make to people living in this area to have all of this open and green space available to them in a way that people living in West Ham or East Ham in Newham don't necessarily have? Perhaps we notice that the houses are slightly different. What kind of housing do we think this might be? Where the roads are quite close together and quite narrow? And what kind of housing are we seeing where these roads are quite a bit more spaced out? Yeah, quite a bit more spaced out. What does that do to people's quality of life? Okay, what I'd like you to do is just write 2 or 3 differences between the map of Newham and the map of Richmond. Perhaps you're going to focus on green spaces and parks and the type of housing that we're going to find. Terraced housing, maybe high-rise flats versus perhaps larger, detached or semi-detached houses, lots of green space for people to hang out in. Pause the video, write some answers down for me, please. Okay, we're almost at the end of this lesson, and our final thing that we're going to look at today in comparing Newham and Richmond is property prices. Now, we've mentioned it briefly before, but we're looking at it in a bit more detail here. I'm going to give you some information here in the slide, but in your worksheet, you have a table and 2 questions. So the table summarises the information that we're about to go to, and these 2 questions, which I would like you to answer, please. So, property prices in Richmond upon Thames involved flats for the majority of sales, and they sell for on average £508,000. So we're talking about more than £500,000 in the average flat price in Richmond upon Thames. Terraced properties, so a terraced property would look like this, where it's got neighbours on both sides, okay, sold for an average price of £872,000, okay, so more than £750,000, while semi-detached properties, which is down here, okay, so semi-detached means that on one side they're joined up, and on the other side, they are detached. They're separate. Okay, so semi-detached property fetches over £1 million on average. So Richmond upon Thames has an overall average price of £829,000. And the average property rent to live in Richmond is over £2,000 per month. Now, it might be that if you were renting in Richmond, you would share with family or with friends, and so the cost of that is going to come down. Maybe that's not one person paying for it. But even so, this is a very, very high cost of living, particularly if you want to buy a house that is detached or semi-detached. Most of the sales in Newham over the past year were flats as well, which on average sold for £433,000. Now, this is still a really high price for housing compared with the whole of the UK. Okay, so I just want to be really clear about that. There's no question that £433,000 is not a lot of money. It is a huge amount of money. But compared with Richmond, Newham is cheaper. Terrace properties have an average sold price of £448,000. So these are our terrace properties again, okay? And they're selling for actually not a huge difference in price between flats and terrace properties. Why do you think that might be the case? When do you think these terraced properties were built? They look reasonably old to you. That's because they were most of them built following the Second World War, when the east of London was devastated by the Blitz and there was a large rebuilding project for much of the housing in London. So a lot of these houses were built in the sort of 1950s after the Blitz. So they're not that old, they're still very nice houses. But what do you think the regeneration might be bringing to East London? What kind of housing are we building now? Do we build new houses like this as terraces? Much less likely to do that. If you were going to build beautiful, big, skyscraper-style flats or apartments, you might sell those for quite a lot of money. And what that's going to do is raise the average price of a flat. We're not just talking about ex-council flats, for instance. We might be talking about fancy new glass and steel tower block flats that have been built in more recent years. So, terrace properties have an average sale price of £448,000, and semi-detached, separated on one side like this, properties average at £510,000. Newham has an overall average price of £441,000. So at least the average price in Newham is still under £500,000. The average property rents for Newham are £1,518 per month. So, earlier on in this lesson, we saw a couple of headlines, didn't we? We said that, if I go back, here we go, London house prices, and I think this is overall, experienced the lowest growth since financial crisis. So following the financial crisis, in that last financial crisis, not the current one that we're about to go through, but the last one in 2008, 2009, the house prices have been growing since then, but recently they've slowed down. So what we're saying is they're still going up in price, but they're only going up by a little bit. And to be honest with you, if your house costs £880,000, then, getting a little bit extra money out of that is probably quite difficult. How much extra are people willing to spend? Whereas we saw that East London house prices are still on the up despite a UK-wide slowdown. And perhaps that's because, compared to the rest of London, Newham house prices are relatively low. So, your two questions then. Where do you think more households are likely to be rented and why? And what is the most commonly sold property type in both areas? And why do you think that is? Now, I have given you both those answers during this little spiel, so pause the video, answer the questions, and then we'll look at some answers. Okay, so coming back to it then. Where do you think more households are likely to be rented? Well, let's be honest. Average prices in Richmond and in Newham are both really high, okay? If you said Richmond, I totally get it, but unfortunately, it's gonna be in Newham. So let's have a look at why that is the case. Although the average property price in Newham is lower than Richmond, average incomes are significantly lower in Newham than in Richmond, leading to a higher level of poverty. As a result, people in Newham are more likely to rent their home than in Richmond. And if you go back all the way perhaps to task 2, we saw how much do people end up spending on affording their home. And in Newham, it's more common for people to be spending on average 55%, so over half of their income just on paying the rent before they've bought food, before they've bought travel card, or they've paid for the bus journey, before they've put fuel in their car or gone out for dinner or anything else. They have just been spending their money on renting their home. So it's a really, really significant cost. So in fact, people in Newham are more likely to rent their home than in Richmond. The most commonly sold type of property in both of those areas, as you should have heard from me, was flats. And why is that? Most likely that's because they are still the cheapest properties available to people. And particularly if you are buying your first home, and this is the first time you've managed to save up enough money to buy a home and get a mortgage from the bank to do that, they're more likely to be able to afford a flat. Although we can mention, of course, that the price differences between flats and houses in Newham is much smaller than the price difference between a flat and a house in Richmond. Okay guys, this is almost the end of the lesson. I just want to remind you please about your homework task. It's attached to this lesson, and your homework task is of course to read just 2 pages of the textbook. I want you to summarize 4 processes about urbanization, counter-urbanization. This homework's not actually due next lesson, in lesson 8. It's due in lesson 9, because lesson 8 we're going to be doing a bit of a GIS exercise. Now, challenge task here. I would love you guys to write me some good responses to this, because this is really an opinion challenge. What do you think, following the coronavirus crisis, where do you think people will want to live and why? Are they more likely to want to live in the centre of town and be able to cycle everywhere and not have to take any public transport? Or are they going to be thinking, no, I don't want to live in a crowded area. I want to live where there's lots of green space, lots of, fresh air. What do you think people will decide after this? What would they prefer? Will it encourage people to start leaving cities like London? I want to know your opinion. Okay guys, thank you so much for engaging with this lesson. I will see you next time with lesson 8. Bye bye.